Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The Cabinet is convening and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the President. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the President all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the President at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines.
Welcome to Bite-Sized Bios. This is meant to be a mini-sode that will accompany HDTH. Every week, I will pick a person from history and dive into their lives. All right, welcome back to another episode of Bite-Sized Bios. I am your host, Richard Dix. This is episode number 37, I want to say. I'm not sure. I thought we had a couple more done than this, but it's only 37. I was going to say 39. It's definitely not that. So yeah, we're episode 37. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, every other Monday we pick a person from history and kind of profile their lives, give you the elevator pitch as to why they are important to history, and then we kind of move on. We don't sit and linger. We don't do too much. It's usually never more than 20 to 25 minutes. Then you find out why they're important to history and hopefully something interesting. But of course, because this is the Minnesota accompaniment to How Did That Happen, which also comes out every other Monday at 4:30 a.m., we have to go back. We have to go back and talk about what I think has been one of the more interesting episodes that I've done in this entire process, was to talk about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I say it's interesting because obviously I was interested by it, but we get to the end and I feel like we know what happened. I mean, we don't, but we know more than we did. Let's put it that way. I think that to be true. The connection that we drew between Jack Ruby and Dr. West, and Dr. West being one of the founding scientists of the MK Ultra, CIA project, and the fact that he was the psychiatrist for Jack Ruby right before he went clinically insane after killing Lee Harvey Oswald, to me is the smoking gun that you need. It's what more do you need? He's the CIA killed JFK. It's what we need to do is figure out why. We have to figure out why now. Maybe that's episode 2. JFK Purdue. But I think to me it makes a lot of sense. Let's see. What's become customary in these is I think about what is the best movie depictions of this stuff. I think last time, if you listened to the last mini episode, you were here when I found out that MASH actually took place in the Korean War. I didn't know that. We found that out live on the pod. I thought it was the Vietnam War. It makes a lot more sense now that it's not. But so yeah, what are good JFK assassination movies? I enjoy Parkland. Parkland is good because that was the first one that I ever knew that focused on the aftermath of it. You know what I mean? The entire thing is basically done from the Parkland Hospital. And what's interesting about the Parkland Hospital, Parkland Memorial, is all 3 of the main players in this assassination all die at the same hospital at different points in history. JFK, pronounced dead. Parkland Hospital, November 22nd, right? Lee Harvey Oswald, pronounced dead. Parkland Hospital, November 24th, all in 63. And then the guy that put the button on it all, Jack Ruby, would die there in like 67, I want to say. A few years later, but still, same hospital. And it cannot be lost on us that all these men died at the same hospital. So check that out, Parkland. It's something I think it's just called Parkland. I think Zac Efron's in that movie. There's also this JFK, which is the Oliver Stone. What I can also direct you to it's not a movie, but it's a book. And like I said, I mentioned in the last podcast, I believe it's called 5 Days in November. It is very interesting. It's a lot of high-res pictures of what happened that day, all in color. It's definitely, I think, worth your time. It's one of those big books. It's not it's how can I put it? It's more pictures than words. If you're worried, it's more pictures than words. But yeah, I think so. That was JFK. I don't know if there's much else to cover about what we may have missed. What the biggest thing that I got from that, and what really kind of blew the whole thing wide open, is the MK Ultra connection, and the fact that the CIA, to me, just is, their hands are dirty in this. And so we're going to explore that connection more, at least in the next couple episodes, because we're going to talk about the CIA, and we're going to talk about all the different things that they did. I think once we get more information about what really happened, because I've done the research now on the MK Ultra, but it was too dense to put in that episode. It just didn't make any sense. It felt like we'd be there all day. We'd be there for 3 hours. If I was like, oh, and now there's another half an hour to talk about MK Ultra, it's like, nah, it's what this is about. We got this all the time in the world with this long form art form here, so we're gonna get into it. It's gonna be on the next episode. Let's see what else is there before we get going here. What am I watching? I am watching a lot of live sports, guys. I'm gonna be honest. I haven't watched much television. It's a good time of the year for a sports fan. Baseball's coming into the playoffs. Football's just starting. Basketball will be here in a couple weeks. I'm loving it. So that's what I'm watching right now. I don't have many recs when it comes to the TV front. What am I listening to? I'll tell you what I'm always listening to. I'm always listening to Up First by NPR. It's not a plug. It's just if you're ever looking for something, because what it is for me is that's like it's almost like bite-sized bios. They give you the news in like 15 minutes. They give you the day's news in like 15 minutes. So I don't really watch too much news. I don't watch a lot of CNN. I'm not on news apps all day long. None of that. But when I wake up in the morning, I say, hey Siri, play Up First. 15 minutes after that, I know what's happening. I don't have to sit here and just watch it all day long. I don't even have to talk about it. I know what happened. Check that out. As always, if you like this podcast, wherever you're finding this podcast, give us 5 stars if you could. 2 stars if you didn't want to. Tell us why you didn't want to give us 5 stars, because constructive criticism is always welcome. I don't think there's much else to say before we get to the pod, so without further ado, as we know what to do, here is the episode.
Well, it seems to me that some people have expected too much. They thought that just signing a charter meant that peace was with us without any further effort on our part. And of course, anyone who really thinks about it knows we'll have to work for peace.
Okay, today we are here to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. Her first name was actually Anna. She was born Anna Eleanor Roosevelt on October the 11th, 1884 in Manhattan, New York City. Her parents were named Anna Rebecca Hall and Elliot Roosevelt. From an early age, she preferred to be called by her middle name. She, of course, is from the famous Roosevelt family. Through her father, she was the niece of President Roosevelt, like Theodore, old Teddy. And through her mother, she was the niece of tennis champion Valentine Valley Hall. Her mother nicknamed her Granny because she acted in such a serious manner as a child. It was said that her mom would basically just kind of ridicule her for like not being that pretty, for just kind of being homely looking, because the time that she was, brought up in, which, like we said, she was born in 1884. I mean, women at that time and on into the future were not expected to do much more but to look pretty and have kids. So she's like, if you can't even look pretty, I mean, geez, what are we even doing here? But so her mom would call her Granny. Her mother emotionally rejected Eleanor and was ashamed of what she called her daughter's quote unquote plainness. Like I said, she was kind of sad that her daughter was just, regular looking. Eleanor had 2 younger brothers, Elliot Jr. and Hall. She also had a half brother, Elliot Roosevelt Mann, through her father's affair with Katie Mann, a servant employed by the family. When she was a child, when she was about 2 years old, she was involved in a ship crash, I guess you could say. She was on board the SSS Britannic with her father, mother, and Aunt Tissy when it collided with the White Star Liner SS Celtic. Now, if you remember the White Star Line, that's the same company that would oversee the Titanic not too long after this, about 15 years later. Just putting that in there just because I think it's interesting. But because of, I guess, even this, what I would imagine is subconscious, because, I mean, she was 2 years old, but because of this, she was always afraid of ships and the sea for her entire life, because I guess she was lowered into a lifeboat during this time, and her parents were taken to the Celtic, and returned to New York. I don't know. I've had long, drawn-out, heated conversations with people in my life about whether or not children of this age can actually recall their memories, because I personally don't have. I mean, think about it. Just think about yourself right now. What's the earliest memory that you have? What's the earliest memory? Just say it out loud. Who knows? Okay, that, right? How old were you when that happened? Me, my first real memory, I would say, I mean, I'm probably 5 or 6 years old. Like kindergarten is my first real memory. Maybe preschool, but definitely not 2 years old. Couldn't tell you what happened to me at 2 years old. But Roosevelt's mom would die of diphtheria on December the 7th, 1892. And one of her brothers would die of the same disease the next year. So she lost a mom, let's see, by the time she was 12, and then also lost I take that back. By the time she was 8. By the time she was 8, she lost her mom. And by 9, she lost her brother. And then her dad would die 2 years later. He had some issues. He would end up suffering from bouts of delirium. He jumped out of a window, or fell, depending on who you ask. Fell out of a window during a fit of like seizures. And I think that the fall, as you can guess, didn't really help his health. He would end up dying a couple years after that. But he was a big alcoholic, raging alcoholic. A lot of the men in her family succumbed to the same thing. Not the window, but the alcoholism. Her other brother, Hall, also suffered from alcoholism. Before her father died, he asked her to watch out for her brother. And so she kind of took this to heart and would become, in her mind, not his mom, but she had very mother-type tendencies about him for pretty much his entire life. Let's see, her brother would even go on to go to Harvard. At some point, Eleanor Roosevelt herself was tutored privately, and with the encouragement of her aunt Anna Bamey Roosevelt, she was sent to Ellenswood Academy, which is just outside London. It's a private finishing school in Wimbledon, where she was there for 3 years. And it was supposedly she really enjoyed it a lot, because what you find in Eleanor Roosevelt's childhood, and really in a lot of parts of her life, is that she felt that people didn't appreciate her for who she was. She felt it was hard for her to find love for just being Eleanor. Even from her mother, like we said, who her mother just was always like, oh, you're not pretty enough, you know. And then her father, who she loved, he dies. Well, I mean, her mom dies too, but she didn't love her mom that much. And so she's just left to she would always come back to this reoccurring feeling of just not being good enough for people, even with her husband. And that brings us to her meeting FDR. So she comes back from London in 1902 because, as we've said, her family was one of the richest families in basically America, definitely in New York. So she was part of like the what they call the swells, or the debutante society. And so she had to come back and basically be introduced to society, have her debutante ball. So that's when she comes back in 1902. And it was said that she didn't want to come back because, like I said, she had kind of found her, not her calling, but she was in the pocket. She was in the pocket in London. She enjoyed where she was at. She had people around her who she thought actually appreciated her for who she was. And when she came back, it was difficult because she hadn't spent her formative years growing with the same people, so she didn't have a lot of friends. She didn't have a lot of friends that were also, well, I mean, maybe she knew these people from when she was younger. You know how it is. I mean, basically, if you leave when you're 13 and you come back when you're 17 or whatever, those are formative years that everyone else was together during. She wasn't. So it was a hard welcome for her. She didn't feel that comfortable when she first came back. But in the summer of 1902, she met her fifth cousin, FDR. They were said to be on the way to a rodeo or at a rodeo. They then ended up becoming engaged on November the 22nd, 1903. FDR's mom was not loving this idea. His mom was named Sarah Ann Delano, and she was supremely opposed to the union. And she made him promise to at least hold off the engagement announcement for at least a year. She was trying to, I guess, convince him otherwise. And she did so by taking him on a cruise, hoping that the separation from her would squelch the romance. But of course, we know absence makes the heart grow fonder, and he came back only wanting his cousin more. So the wedding date was set to accommodate President Theodore Roosevelt, who is Eleanor's uncle. And it was scheduled to be in New York City for the St. Patrick's Day, because he was going to give the bride away. He did give the bride away. He walked Eleanor down the aisle, right? And then when he got to the end, right, when he got to the priest, or I assume it was a priest, he kissed Eleanor on the cheek, love you, E, right? Then slapped FDR on the back and said, quote, "It's a good thing to keep the name in the family," end quote. Then he walked away, probably laughing too hard at his own joke, if I'm guessing. That's just, it's a little much for me. I think anybody, I don't know. It's very royal. It's very royalty-like. It reminds you of, like, the Habsburgs and and all of that, the Tudor family. It's like, it's not good. Scientifically not good to keep the name in the family. Like, I can point to you to any number of graphs that will explain to you why it's not good to keep your name, quote unquote, in the family. They would actually, once they were married, they went on a 3-month tour of Europe. And what I find interesting about this relationship, the Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR, is they realized almost immediately that they weren't really cut out for the traditional marriage, if you will, but they were also in a time where there was nothing but the traditional marriage. You couldn't have any other options, because it goes back to kind of what I was saying before about the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt wanted to be loved unconditionally for who she was, right? She wanted to be loved for just being E-Roos. That's what I call her, E-Roos, Eleanor Roosevelt. But FDR wouldn't give it to her. FDR, he wasn't set up to give her that love. He, in turn, also wanted to love himself. He wanted to be loved the same way that any man of the 20th century wanted to be loved. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to be put on a pedestal, right? He wanted that. She was not going to give him that. She didn't even like having sex with a man. She was said, she once told her daughter that it was, quote unquote, an ordeal to be born, end quote. That's how she talks about her intimate actions with her husband. She wasn't a fan, right? Despite that being the case, they had 6 kids. So she was a fan a couple times. All right, so they had 6 kids. Anna, Eleanor Roosevelt, James Roosevelt II, Franklin Roosevelt, Elliott Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., and then John Roosevelt. Those are all their kids. She also didn't think she was that great of a mom. And actually, I think when one of her kids died, after I think it was about the age 1 or 2, she definitely took that pretty hard and thought that was indicative of her lackluster mothering. It also didn't help that she found out that her boo thang, old FDR, was loving on some other women. In 1918, specifically September 1918, Roosevelt was unpacking one of FDR's suitcases when she discovered a bundle of love letters to him from her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. So FDR was being unfaithful. And for a long time, he had been contemplating leaving his wife for Mercer, right? But because everyone in his life was like, no, don't do that. And because at this time, kind of like what I was saying earlier, there wasn't the space for all of this to happen. If he would divorce Eleanor, he would probably lose all political cachet that he had grown during that time. So his mom even said, if you leave her, I'm going to pull you out of your inheritance, which is crazy when you think about it, because his mom didn't even like her. Like, Sarah Delano was not a fan from Jump Street of Eleanor Roosevelt. But she told him, you leave her, you're losing this money. So by that time, their union was basically a political partnership. This is when she really throws herself into public life, because she wasn't happy at home. And she was not happy at home for a long time. Throughout the 1920s, Roosevelt became increasingly influential as a leader in the New York State Democratic Party, while Franklin used her contacts among Democratic women to strengthen his standing with them, winning their committed support for the future. So, of course, FDR would go on to become governor of New York, and then he would become the president of the United States. That brings us to First Lady Roosevelt. Roosevelt became the First Lady of the United States when Franklin was inaugurated on March the 4th, 1933. Having known all of the 20th century's previous First Ladies, she was seriously depressed at having to assume the role, which had traditionally been restricted to domesticity and hostessing. I was surprised, literally, when I was watching a documentary about this time, that it wasn't a documentary, it was an interview between her and somebody else, another guy she was talking to, but he was like, you did all the stuff that the other first ladies could never do. And the first thing he listed was read. It will be on, it should be on the work site. I'm not sure if I have. I think I have it, but I'm not sure if I have the actual interview. But he says things like read. What else did he say? Women's suffrage, voting. But it's like, reading is the first one. It made me think. I was like, is he saying that all the previous first ladies couldn't read? I don't know. I was like, wow. But yeah, so she came in here, switched it up. She's like, I'm not doing none of that. I'm definitely reading, bro. Reading all day long up in here, son. And changing the idea of what the First Lady was. She set out to, quote unquote, redefine the position. She became the most controversial First Lady in the United States history. In the process, she had strong support from her husband the entire time. She continued with the active business she had created and speaking agenda she had begun before assuming the role of First Lady in an era where few married women had careers. And according to the guy I watched in the interview, none of them were reading either. She was the first presidential spouse to hold regular press conferences, and in 1940 became the first to speak at a national party convention. She also wrote a daily and widely syndicated newspaper column called My Day, another first for a presidential spouse. So they were surprised she could write either. She was also the first lady to write a monthly magazine column and to host a weekly radio show. So she did a lot. You could really give her the flowers and credit her with being the reason why the modern first lady even exists. I mean, obviously we were going to continue to progress, and that's something that she even says. I mean, I would recommend anybody, if you don't know much about her, check it out, because I watched at least 3 or 4 interviews by her that were captivating. They were interesting. Like, it was interesting to hear. You could tell she had a command of, I'm not even sure how to, like, not just, she had a command of the world. She seemed to understand what was going on and have a pretty good idea about it. There's one interview that I watched, and the guy asked her, this is in, I think, 1957, and he's like, yeah, well, because Eisenhower's presidency is coming to the end, and he's like, who do you think is gonna, take up after him? And he says a few names, and I mean, she literally, without like throwing shade, is like, yo, Richard Nixon's not that great of a guy.
Now, on the Republican side, of course, the only one who stands out is Mr. Nixon, and he has made no mistakes of late. He's been extremely careful. I would say he had ability. How much conviction is another question. You need to have deep-rooted convictions, and I have a feeling from the kind of campaigns that I have watched Mr. Nixon in the past, that his convictions are not very strong.
I just want to be like, wow. Like, if the world could just take your advice 13 years, in the past, before we get to Watergate and all this stuff that he did. But she said it in such a underhanded, like, nice way that I was like, you have to know words to know she's saying this ain't the guy for the job. And for us to find out later on that she was 100% right, I mean, I'm saying, check it out. She is worth your time. Let's see. We get on down. FDR dies, which we've covered before. He dies in 1945 after suffering a cerebral hemorrhage in Georgia at what is called the Little White House. What's messed up about that is that Eleanor learns, because basically she wasn't there when her husband dies. She was not at the deathbed. He didn't send for her. He didn't call like, oh, my girl, baby. Oh, come on, Eleanor. He didn't give her none of that. Right. And she was kind of wondering why, I guess. But then she found out through her daughter that one of his mistresses, one of the ones that he had been had for a long time, and she thought low key was out of the picture. Oh, she snuck back in the picture, all the way up in the picture, all the way to his deathbed, and had been comforting him all the way up until he died. She found this out. She was not a fan of this. She was actually mad at her daughter for a long time about it. They would reconcile, but I mean, she was really hurt. She was hurt. Like, that's what I said earlier. It's like she spent her entire life trying to be loved for who she is. And it seems like most people in her life just could not extend her that gratitude. They couldn't do that. And it's sad. She was able to find a little bit of love, you could think, throughout her life. She had, what was that? The Hickok lady, who she kind of may or may not have been, a lesbian with. There, everybody's like, oh, she wasn't a lesbian. It's like, you read the letter, she might have been a lesbian. It's okay, though. You know what I mean? But let's just call a spade a spade. But she was never able to fully realize that. But she would end up, even after, FDR dies, Truman comes in, he takes over the presidency, drops the bomb, kaboom, World War II's over, we all go home. Then she becomes an ambassador to the UN for the U.S. She really, that's her second act. She becomes a lot more known, I would say, universally. She's known pretty well at that point. There's not much else to say, I think, about her without diving into. We're going to talk about her death real fast. So I'm going to give you a quick timeline, just so you can understand where she falls at in the modern part of the world. Because I feel like, for me, you think about her, and I in my head see her just as the president's wife. I see her as the first lady who's helping FDR get through the Great Depression, stuff like that. But you realize she really was instrumental in the progression of American society up in through the 50s and into the early 60s. She met with John F. Kennedy in 1960. He reappoints her to the UN because basically she had been appointed by Truman, but she left the UN when Eisenhower became president. She gets reappointed by Kennedy in 61. And she had some interesting things to say about Eisenhower, too. I'll tell you, it was really interesting to hear from somebody who knows these people and knew multiple powerful individuals. One thing she said about Eisenhower is he's good following a plan, is what she said. And I was like, that's probably so true.
Well, that's, of course, a very difficult thing to say because I barely know the president. I've seen him as a general when he was in Germany. I've seen him in London as a general. I would say that he was a diplomat. I would say that he was very good at carrying out things that had been planned, and probably a fine general, though he was, of course, in the field under General Marshall's general direction.
He's a soldier at heart. He's good at following orders, which is why I think what you find when you look back at Eisenhower's presidency is that he didn't have a lot of, wasn't a lot of creativity. It was a lot of just, sticking to the plan, which is what he did in the military, which makes a lot of sense. So yeah, we get to her death here. So she was diagnosed with aplastic anemia once she was struck by a car in April 1960 while she was in NYC. In 1962, she was given steroids, which activated a dormant case of tuberculosis in her bone marrow. Like, they don't even know when she got TB, but because of this, the steroids, it just, it kind of manifested it, if you will. She died at age 78 of a resulting cardiac failure at her Manhattan home on East 74th Street on the Upper East Side. She was cared for by her daughter. When this happened, JFK ordered all United States flags lowered to half staff. In tribute to her, funeral services were held 2 days later in Hyde Park. She was interred next to her husband in the Rose Garden at Springwood Estate in the Roosevelt family home. Now, what's interesting is I was watching a documentary, and I swear the dude said, he was like, this was attended by 4 presidents, right? And he mentioned Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and he mentioned Johnson. But I'm like, dude, this is 1962. Johnson's not president. If what you're saying is true of these 4 presidents, then one of the 4 presidents that's attending is also dead. You know what I mean? Like, I was just like what are we doing? All right, that was E-Roos, Eleanor Roosevelt. That's my nickname for her, E-Roos. It's not much, but it's something. It's our connection. Don't hate. Learned a lot about this lady. Like I said before, she was just really kind of relegated to just a picture in a textbook for me. I can literally, before I did this, I had like one image in my mind of her from when I learned about her when I was like 14, right? But you learn about her, and I can honestly say, like I said earlier in the pod, I was just captivated by hearing her speak. The woman, she was a very smart woman. She's a very smart person, and I would implore you to check out some of her speeches. A lot of speeches from the 50s and the 40s do not transfer. They don't age well. A lot of her stuff does. You could tell she was someone who was aware of what's going on currently, but also knew that things were going to change in the future, which she even mentions is one of the main issues that America has or had during that time, is why we are having trouble even fighting against the communists or even creating a more viable product, a better thing for competition, is because we weren't diverse enough. And she even said that. And so it's interesting just to hear someone say that in the 50s, when we all know that was basically the truth. We were not leaning on our diversity as a country the way we should have. But yeah, so that's another BSB in the books. We're approaching 40 eps for the bite-sized bios. Always appreciate everybody that comes back and presses play from week to week. Give us 5 stars wherever you find this. If you love it, if you didn't love it, give us 2 stars. Tell us why you didn't want to give us 5 stars, because constructive criticism is always welcome. We definitely always want to hear your opinion, what you liked, what you didn't like. Let me know. Let's see. I don't think there's much else to say before we get out of here. I will actually, because I've been talking about it, I'm going to play you guys out with a couple words from 1957 Eleanor Roosevelt interview. So see you guys next week with the next How Did That Happen?
And I have complete faith in the American people's ability, if they know And if they have leadership, no one can move without some leadership.